We talk a lot about the current Pacers on this podcast. Let's go all the way back to the very beginning of the Pacers franchise and talk about the formation of it and what it means for the team now by talking about the book Reborn by Mark Montieth, about the earliest days of the Pacers franchise and how the groundwork was laid for what you know today. It's all coming today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Thursday, everybody, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today it's the final book club of the month of this summer. Today, diving in to Reborn, Mark Montieth's book about the Pacers, their return to Indianapolis, I guess the return of pro basketball to Indianapolis to be more clear, and what that was like in the earliest days of the ABA. Fascinating read for me to learn a lot about how many things had to go right for the Pacers early in their days as a franchise in the ABA and how that all set up both their success long-term and how they became an NBA franchise. Who better to talk about Reborn by Mark Montieth than Mark Montieth himself? He's going to join us for this whole conversation, talking about stories from the book, his research process, all sorts of fun stuff. It's a fantastic show. I'm glad to get it out this August. I think there was a lot of good stuff for everyone this month, from current events to FIBA play to two book clubs. Last time looking at Blood in the Garden, the Pacers-Knicks overlaps in the 1990s. Of course, the How They Can Help series, which will continue next week, and player interviews. Kiefer Sykes was yesterday, Oscar Tshiebwe early this month. I believe another one next week. For the housekeeping here at Locked On Pacers, next week will be no Labor Day show and no Friday show this week. So a 4-day, air quotes, weekend. 4 episodes next week, talking more about FIBA, hopefully another player interview, How They Can Help featuring the new forwards, and one more show. And then we're back to every single day here on Locked On Pacers. But I won't keep you waiting. Let's talk with Mark Montieth about Reborn and the earliest days of the Pacers franchise. Today, we're talking about Reborn, a book on the earliest days of the Pacers franchise. Got it right here for those of you who can actually see it, about the formation of the Pacers, their early days in the ABA, and more. And you get some early hints of names involved in the Pacers that have transcended time. And joining me to talk about this book, perhaps the perfect person. In fact, I can cut the perhaps. The person who knows more about it because he wrote it. It's Mark Montieth, the author of the book, formerly with, good Lord, the Indy Star, Pacers.com, now with IBJ, writing more books. Mark, thank you for the time. Much appreciated.
Yeah, Tony, good to be with you.
It was fascinating diving into all this because I learned during last season that my basketball history, being 28 years old, is embarrassing. I don't know anything pre my A. I barely know stuff about the Jordan era. So diving into all this stuff has been fascinating for me. And I figure the team I cover, I should really get into the history of. And Mark, I'm going to ask you about two things on the first 10 pages of the book from a general perspective. One is a player on a pre-Pacers franchise, the Couts guys. I want to make sure I'm saying that right. Yes, who made $50 a game, which was insane to me to see. A player who plays 24 minutes per game right now on a league minimum salary makes about $500 per minute in the NBA. The other part in the first 10 pages was two teams experimenting playing in Indianapolis with 12-foot rims in a game. So those two anecdotes I lob to you to say, how much have you seen, both for your research and your own eyes, the NBA change? Because I know those weren't NBA games, but seeing those numbers and those anecdotes compared to now just kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that Indianapolis had an NBA franchise from the first year of the NBA, the Olympians, 49-50 season. And obviously they were playing a much different game than what the Pacers play today. No three-point shot, of course, no time clock, no 24-second clock. Guys didn't dunk, just a completely different type of game. So as the athletes have gotten better and more skilled, the game has improved in my mind. I guess I'm old enough to be nostalgic, but I'm not one of these guys who will tell you, oh, the guys back then were so much better than today. It's not true. It's not true. It's almost like the guys today have hacked the game because they're so talented with their three-point shooting, their athleticism. To me, the rims are a little too low and the court isn't quite big enough to really allow the athletes to spread out and do what they could do. But Yeah, Indianapolis was fortunate to have an original NBA franchise, and they had pro basketball teams before that, going back to the late 20s, early 30s. And so, Indianapolis had pro basketball teams before there was a jump ball, before or when there was a jump ball after every basket. So, kind of the Indianapolis pro teams have traced the history of basketball in general all these years.
I wish I could have seen the 12-foot ring. I believe you had in there that George Mikan went 2 of 14 in that game. Like, just to see even the best players totally struggle from that change, I think would have been totally fascinating to see in person.
Yeah, it's funny. People talk about, when they talk about the rim being too low, and in some ways it is for today's athletes, they talk about there ought to be a 12-foot rim, and I don't know why 12 feet. Sports Illustrated once ran a cover story back in the 60s of the case for the 12-foot rim. And I could see raising the rim, but not 2 feet. That'd be pretty crazy. I could see raising it 3 inches or maybe 6 inches or something like that. But I don't know why people come up with 12 feet. But there was a game played with 12-foot rims once just to kind of see how it went. And, obviously players hadn't practiced at that height or anything. It had to be a real mess. It's a shame that there was no video of it, but there was a game, an NBA game with a 12-foot rim.
Not only a mess, but I believe you had in there that the next day when there was a game in there, there was a player who went and bought a soda and drank it at halftime, and they were drinking beer in the locker room. Just not the same basketball experience as we see today. Something else that struck me pretty early in this reading that I didn't really know is, growing up here when I did, I think of Indy more as a sports town now, but at the time the Pacers were forming, or at least trying to be formed, before the ABA was even really a thing, is there was a committee searching for any pro sports team in Indy, not necessarily basketball, but looking at pro football, pro hockey, the MLB, even though the Indians were already here. And you laid out those pursuits of other sports, but kind of how much to you of the Pacers formation and being in Indy was just kind of lucky timing around that summer?
Yeah, a lot. Really fortunate timing. The city was ready for something. The Olympians, who were in the NBA, folded in 1953 due to a scandal. And so the city went 14 years without professional football, without professional basketball, and hockey kind of came and went during that time. So the city was growing and wanted to be major league in something. And there had been some pursuits of getting an NBA franchise over the years, but nobody really had the money to get an expansion franchise. There was even talk about getting the Royals to play some of their home games in Indianapolis. And one thing that I didn't remember growing up here that I learned in my research was just most years between mid-50s up to the ABA's formation in 67, there was an NBA game here, 1 or 2 a year, played out at the Coliseum. When Oscar Robertson joined the Royals, they'd play a game over here. Slick Leonard played here in a game with the Chicago Zephyrs one time. So, like once a year, there would be an NBA game here out at the Coliseum, the regular season game. And the NBA Finals even had a couple games here in the mid-50s with the Fort Wayne Pistons because they couldn't use their facility. But the city wanted a franchise and something that was major league. And there was a real sincere effort to grow the city, not just in sports, but in other aspects of arts and so forth. Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee, I believe is what it was called. And guys like, some of the people who are still with us today were part of those committees, actually. I'm told the committee still exists, although I never hear anything about it. But the getting a franchise was a big part of that. And it just so happened somebody formed the ABA late 66 going into 1967. And Indianapolis got wind of that, and a group of guys put money down to put dibs on a franchise for the ABA. Cost $6,000 at a meeting in New York. And lo and behold, the city had a franchise.
Hey, everybody, let's take a short little break so I can talk to you about FanDuel. Roster cuts are done. The NFL season is so close. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 on FanDuel, and you'll get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet that $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. That's a great deal. Now is the best time to join FanDuel, the app. Super easy to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props, your faves, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer that you will not want to miss. That's FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. That was something else that struck me too, is the $6,000 deposit wasn't a guarantee that you'd actually get a team, right? Like a team from Hawaii was trying to put in money and all this stuff. Like seeing how they tried to organize it and prioritize everything even kind of added to the luck element to me.
Yeah, it's one thing to put $6,000 down and say you have a franchise, but at some point you got to spend a lot more than that.
Right.
Actually have a franchise. You got to hire people, you got to have office space, all these expenses that come with having a professional franchise. Eventually, there was a meeting in New Orleans, and the owners of this team had to fork over $30,000 to officially have a franchise. But there was a meeting in New York, and a group of businessmen in Indianapolis and Lafayette put in like $1,000 a piece and claimed a franchise. And of course, at that time, there wasn't a red, white, and blue ball or anything, but there are pictures of George Mikan with the basketball that says Indianapolis on it. And it hit the newspapers that Indianapolis was back in pro basketball and had this team in this new league that most people didn't know anything about, and most people probably assumed would really never come to exist.
Especially because the ABL failed so recently, right? Right before that. So, the competition for an NBA competitor didn't work before. And in fact, that was kind of a fun subplot to me of all this, was some gambles by NBA teams that the ABA would fail and that they would be able to then scoop up a lot of the player assets and likeness of the ABA, which of course never happened. You just mentioned a financial part of this, like you pay the $6,000, but then you have to pay your players and your staff. And one of the anecdotes that made me laugh was Bob Nedelicki negotiating a Corvette, correct, into his contract. And a Corvette was several players' cars were involved in the negotiations of their contracts. That made me chuckle, especially because the GM of the Pacers, the first GM, didn't really understand what he was doing, giving that away. You had a lot more contract details than that. Do you remember any other quirks or silly things of that nature when they were trying to lure people in at the beginning?
Yeah, well, in Nedelicki's case, he had some negotiating power because he had been drafted by the NBA team, by San Diego. So when he came in, the Pacer owners knew they had to compete for him, and they negotiated a contract, and he asked about a car, and Mike Storn said, okay, and said, what kind? Nedelicki said a Corvette, and Storn said, what's a Corvette? He said, it's a Chevrolet. And so he got it. He had use of a Corvette for a year. Nedelicki's father was a surgeon, and so Neto grew up in a wealthy family, and he drove a Corvette every year. His dad bought him a Corvette every year when he was in college. So he was used to driving Corvettes. In fact, he even flew himself in for one of his negotiating sessions because he had a pilot's license. So that was unusual. Matthew H., a player from Michigan State that only lasted 1 year, got himself a car through negotiating with Mike Storn. And the story was that H asked about a car, and Storn said, okay. And H said, well, what car? What kind of car? And Storn pointed out the window to where he had a rental car. And he said, well, that car like that out there. And H thought he was going to get literally that car. So Storn had to explain, no, not that car, but I'll get you a car like that, and H wound up only playing 1 year and didn't play that much in the year he was with the team. So, crazy things like that. Some guys got, Larry Humes, who was an usher at Pacer games not that long ago, out of Madison, Indiana, Mr. Basketball in 1962, All-American at Evansville, had been drafted by the Chicago franchise in 1966, didn't quite make that team. Pacers scoop him up in 67. They're excited about a former Mr. Basketball and local guy, Evansville All-American, and they gave him a $2,000 signing bonus. He recalls going to the bank and going home and spreading out all those $20 bills on his bed. Look at this, I got $2,000. Pacers were so confident he'd be on the team. They scheduled both a preseason and regular season game at his high school gymnasium, and then he wound up getting cut. He was the last guy cut from the team. So they still had to go down to Madison and play a regular season game at the high school gym there. Not very many people went, obviously, and they kind of got ripped in the newspaper down there. But that kind of stuff, just weird stuff like that. A franchise, you got to think, it's harder than being an expansion franchise, because when you're an expansion franchise, there are rules and policies to follow. You have a league that you're going to be in. This is a team in a league that may never play a game. They're trying to convince people to come with us and we'll play next year. So it was a real shaky thing from the beginning, but the Pacers actually had a firmer foundation than any other team in the league.
I think you wrote about Humes that they told him 95% chance you'd make the team, correct? And then a lot changed between then.
Did not happen. Yeah.
That's pretty jarring to hear about. But hey, he got to enjoy the moment with the money on his bed. A league moment I'm kind of curious about. I don't know if you know any more about this than what you had in there, but George Mikan at one point suggesting, and this is funny given the current state of the NBA especially, that there would be a 6-foot arc for a 1-point shot circle. Do you know how serious that ever was? And what do you kind of think of that idea conceptually? Because that would make the 2-pointer and the mid-range shot more valuable, as some have kind of wanted in the modern era.
You could argue it's not a bad idea. It'd make refereeing that much more difficult to determine if I was in the arc,
No kidding.
But, it was discussed, but I don't think it was a serious discussion. And of course, the idea for the 3-point shot didn't come around for a while. The ABL, as you know, had tried it. So there was a little bit of history with it. But, George Mikan pushed for it because he wanted a little guy to have a place in the game. And of course, he was one of the great centers of all time when he was the commissioner, but he wanted the little guy to have a place in the league. So he thought giving 3 points for a shot was good. And he really pushed for the red, white, and blue ball. And to me, that's iconic. I mean, when people think of the ABA now, they think of the red, white, and blue ball. And it really was a beautiful thing to watch. And so while George Mikan wasn't really a good commissioner, he certainly helped the league get off the ground and had some good ideas, and he lent some name recognition to the league. And I know a lot of people were skeptical about the 3-point shot and the red, white, and blue ball because they were new things. But George Mikan pushed forward and got it through, and some of the other ideas that weren't as strong got shoved aside.
It was really fascinating, too, to think about, and you just kind of talked about this with, it's not an expansion team, it's a whole new team, of how much the Pacers, especially early, kind of chased local players. Of course, Oscar Robertson being the headline of that. He never actually played for the Pacers, but the Van Arsdale, several Mr. Basketballs, like, they really wanted those local guys to kind of draw in, interest locally when they could. Do you feel like they over-indexed on that? Why do you feel like that was so important to them? Because the ticket sale data was always really good, and like you said, they were more financially solvent than some other teams. But how much interest do you feel like in the league was due to the local stars versus just seeing pro basketball at the time?
Oh, I think the guys they pursued were pretty established. The Van Arsdales were both in the NBA, and they happened to be free agents in 1967. Oscar Robertson happened to be a free agent in 1967. And the Pacers offered him an opportunity to be player coach, offered him like $90,000 and a clothing allowance and all kinds of things, made a serious offer. He never took their offer seriously because he wasn't going to leave the Royals for a league that may not ever make it. And he didn't want to coach anyway. But and John McLaughlin was a guy they had interest in. So the guys with Indiana backgrounds that they pursued, for the most part, were pretty established players. And they no doubt would have really helped the team. I mean, the Van Arsdales, I think they both played in the league 12 years. And McLaughlin had a long career, played on championship teams. And, of course, we know about Oscar Robertson. So it was legitimate. It was a legitimate effort to have a good team. But certainly there was the bonus of them being able to sell some tickets.
The name Pacers, I thought this was so fascinating, even when you dug through newspaper archives, that the origin of the name specifically could never really be found, right? Storin said, I think, something about it being fan submitted. Some people thought that someone else came up with it. What is your best guess from your research?
Yeah, I've never been able to come up with a good answer for that. Who came up with the idea of Pacers? Now, Storin claims it was his idea. Mike was a good GM, but he was prone to, stretch things a little bit, so far the truth is concerned. There was a lady I know who took credit for it. I just don't know. It's lost to history. It surprises me that in the newspaper articles, when they announced this team would be called the Pacers, they didn't say who came up with it. And a lot of people think it has to do with the Indianapolis 500. It really does not. It has to do with harness racing at the fairgrounds track across from the Coliseum at the State Fairgrounds. there's a little bit of a tie into the Indianapolis 500, but not really. When you think about it, have you ever heard the pace car referred to as a pacer? No, nobody ever says, "Oh, the pacer this year's really cool, Corvette or whatever." It's not a pacer. A pacer is a type of horse that competes in harness racing. So that's really what it comes down to. Now, I think it's a good name for a professional basketball team. They talk about we want to set the pace, but it really is about harness racing more so than the Indianapolis 500.
Another fun, not Pacers thing that I enjoyed was the hosting of the 1968 first ever ABA AllStar Game, which was very well promoted and hyped up and did not turn out to sell as many tickets as they claimed. Do you remember a lot of local buzz for that, or do you know anyone who actually attended? What can you recall at all about that game, both from your research and from your life?
Right. I know people who went to it. I did not. Let's see, I would have been 12 years old at that time. Went to some Pacer games that first year, but didn't go to the All-Star game. The Pacers did the league a huge favor, put that thing on, lost about $40,000 doing it. They got it televised, though, to most of the major market areas around the country. And a Los Angeles station came in and did the broadcast. Rick Barry was color commentator. And so it was great publicity for the ABA. And the guys put on a pretty good show who played in the game. But it didn't draw well. They announced that it was announced as a sellout. It was announced as 11,000 people or whatever. The actual bodies and seats was something like, it was less than 5,000, if I remember correctly, 4,000 to 5,000. But people spread out in the lower seating area over there at Butler, and it looked pretty full on television because they didn't show the upper areas. They had some bad luck with competition. First of all, the weather was bad that day, so that didn't help walk-up ticket sales. IU had a basketball game that night on television, and Purdue played one that was on the radio. So the college fans had something else to do, and the weather didn't help. So it didn't draw well, and the Pacers lost a lot of money, but it still was a big boost for the league.
Yeah, that was really fascinating to see, especially the controversy about voting on MVP before the end of the game, and we'll get to Mel Daniels actually right now, because another fun part of seeing this was I didn't know that. I knew they traded for Mel Daniels. I didn't realize how much the Minnesota franchise literally folding and needing money played into that being possible for them. And Mel Daniels, of course, should have been the MVP of that first All-Star game. And so I want to make sure I get this right. It was Jimmy Dawson, Ron Kozlicki, and $150,000 was the trade for Mel Daniels?
I think 100,000.
100,000. Oh, that's right. That's right. It was the business guy wanted 150,000, but it was actually 100,000. And yeah. What a steal, first of all, because Mel Daniels is a Hall of Famer and a huge pivot point for the franchise. Like, of all the things that went well for the Pacers or went their way, how significant was that one to you in terms of being a pivotal moment in them both being good and sticking as a franchise forever?
Yeah, I think you could make a good argument that the Pacers wouldn't be here today if not for that trade, because, without Mel, the Pacers finished 2 games under 500 that first season. And, people were starting to lose a little bit of interest. Everybody was excited when it first began, but you know how it goes. If you keep losing, fan interest will drop off. If they had remained a mediocre team, they probably would have folded at some point. They didn't make money when they were winning, so they certainly weren't going to survive when they were losing, if they were or just an average team. So the Pacers had a lot of luck those first couple of years. In fact, whenever they have something that's bad luck today, I think, well, they had so much good luck their first couple of years, they burned about 50 years worth of good luck right there. So they got Mel for a steal because the Minneapolis franchise was moving to Miami. They desperately needed cash. And the people in Miami didn't know any better. They probably never heard of Mel Daniels. They were going to complain about the trade. They were hopefully just happy to be getting a franchise down there. So it was a great opportunity for the Pacers to get Mel on the cheap like that. And no other franchise apparently in the ABA could come up with a better offer. So the Pacers got him basically for $100,000 and 2 guys who never played again. And it made all the difference in the world to get a future league MVP and a Hall of Famer who, to me, was the heart and soul of their championship teams. If without that trade, the Pacers, again, probably don't exist today. You could also say without getting Slick Leonard to coach the team, they might not exist. Without getting Roger Brown on the team, they don't exist. There's a few different things that were all crucial. but it all came together eventually. But getting Mel Daniels was certainly as big a deal as any of them to keep the franchise here.
And all three of those things you just said happened in their first 2 years of ABA existence, which is totally fascinating. Something I appreciated that you included in the epilogue is if there was like kind of not even conflicting, but just like slightly different recountings of a tale, you would try to include both sides. And with the Daniels trade, there was something about the Kentucky Colonels driving up and they were going to offer more money to the Minnesota team, but no one ever actually verified that happened.
Yeah, I got a hold of the Colonel, Joe Gregory, who owned the Colonels, and I think he's still alive. And he was certainly alive when I did the book. I called him. He said, no, that wasn't the case. But Mel and Nedelicki, for some reason, on camera, started telling that story like, oh, the Colonels were right behind with a better offer, but they were just a little too late. There's no source of that. I don't know where those guys came up with that story, but I found no verification whatsoever. And you have to believe that, when the Minneapolis franchise was moving, they're at the league meeting, they had to have just thrown it out there. Hey, Mel Daniels is for sale. Give me your best offer, and if somebody had a better one, they would have taken that one instead. So I don't think there's any verification to the Colonels, being ready to give a better offer.
We can and will talk about some of the other significant personnel moments between players and coaches of the Pacers sticking and being relevant in Indy. But another one you wrote about and had a whole chapter on this being a big focus of it, at least, was the 3-1 comeback against the Colonels in the 1969, their second season, postseason. They were down 3-1, and they came back and won that series, ended up making it to the finals that year. What, to you, was the significance of that series, winning it, and of that run, making the finals in the second year? Of course, they ended up winning 3 of the next 4 after that, but in terms of fan interest, in terms of keeping coaches, which we'll talk about in a second, all sorts of stuff, how much was that comeback pivotal to their start as well?
Yeah, to me, that's when the city really fell in love with the Pacers. They really came on strong that second year after Slick Leonard took over as coach, after getting off to a terrible start and firing Larry Staverman. But, they're down 3-1 to the Colonels, and the Colonels started talking pretty confidently in the press about winning that series. And, as you can imagine, geographically, there was a great rivalry between the two cities just a couple hours apart down the interstate. And to be down 3-1 and make that comeback and actually win a Game 7 on the home court, it was treated like a championship. I mean, the cover of the book is, them carrying Slick off the floor after winning Game 7 at the Coliseum after being down 3-1. The back cover of the book is the line of fans waiting to get tickets, for Game 7 out in front of their office on 38th Street. And so it was really a turning point. And to me, when the city really fell in love with the Pacers and got excited about the team, you think about the Pacer history, Tony, almost all the greatest moments have come on the road, right? Reggie's moments in the NBA, most of their huge playoff wins have come on the road. But this was one that happened at home. They had a Game 7 in a first-round series at home, and after being down 3-1, came back and won that series. And the fans stormed the court, carried Slick and some of the players off the court. It was treated like a championship.
Yeah, I truly wondered how, if I was a fan at the time, what that would have meant just to see them finally have that level of success. And they did make the finals that year, and that Oakland team was extremely talented and beat them. Something else that came from that I thought was interesting, and you knew Slick pretty well, so I'm curious if you have more insight on this, was that, okay, so he had a sales job at Herff Jones while coaching, and he wasn't sure if he would come back for his second season. Do you feel like that was actually a hard decision for him, or was he just pretending it was a hard decision when he went on this vacation to decide? And again, you knew him well. How big was that for the franchise for him to actually return and be what he was?
Yeah, I think he was going to come back because he knew he had a young, talented team. Maybe at the very moment he was interviewed, he was tired and kind of burned out and thought maybe he wouldn't want to do it. But I can't imagine he ever seriously considered not coming back. It was probably a negotiating ploy, although his first contract, which I actually have a copy of, was for 2 years. So he was kind of stuck with the contract, which I think paid like $22,500 or something like that first year. And he got bonuses for getting to the finals and all that. But that was pretty good money in 1969. It may not sound like it today, but that was actually good money. Bob Knight's first contract at IU in 1971 was for $20,000. So for a coach to be getting over 20,000 in the late 60s, early 70s was pretty much the norm. And so he was going to come back. I think like in July or something like that, they announced he was coming back and had a press conference and made a big deal out of it. But I have to believe he was coming back all along.
Yeah, I think that's the impression you gave when you said it was, he loved the competitive part of it. And of course, he is now a legend within the franchise. But that I didn't know that he, even if it was fake, pretended that he might not have returned. I think that would have been another key pivotal point to look back on in history. The last thing I really want to kind of ask about is, you mentioned, I talked to you about this before we started chatting here, is that you kind of hope to make this a trilogy, both with the pre-ABA basketball in Indiana. You have a little bit of that at the beginning, and then the rest of the ABA days until the NBA. But this is sort of outside of the book, but the transition to the NBA and the merger that the two leagues had, like that's 7 years before the Colts were even in Indy. Like, how significant was that for the franchise in Indianapolis, just that the ABA worked and they were able to kind of be a part of that big league all of a sudden?
Yeah, it was huge. It was really huge because even though, the fans here love the ABA, the NBA was still the bigger deal. It was the more established league, and they had a lot of great players. The ABA did too, I realized, but the NBA was still the more established league, and it was the league that was going to survive. And so for the Pacers to get into it, it created a lot of enthusiasm, no question about it. People were excited about the Boston Celtics coming in all of a sudden with John Havlicek or different guys, and you go right down the line of players who are going to suddenly come in and play in Indianapolis. So it was huge, and the Pacers again were very lucky to get into it. They had to come up with $3.2 million, and there was basically one guy in town, William Eason, who put that money up and went to New York and wrote the check. And the Pacers got into the NBA. Just like they had gotten into the ABA 9 years earlier, it just took a lot more money this time. And it really was kind of one guy who did it for the Pacers to get them into the NBA. They still struggled, and after a few years, the attendance wasn't good, but still they got in, and there was a lot of excitement. I remember seeing when that merger happened. I was just out of college, and I was excited about it. That Pacers are an NBA team, and you're thinking of all the franchises or players that were going to be coming into town that you could go see play now. So, we all know about the telethon to save the franchise. That was a year later, but just to get in there was a big deal, and it wasn't automatic by any means. Somebody had to come up with a lot of money, and the Pacers had to really bite the bullet and give up a first-round draft pick, and they were really penalized for, getting admitted to the NBA, but it did happen.
You have so many details from conversations, moments, and stuff about people in this book that were fascinating, but I'm curious if there's any one thing in there or one story that is your favorite from your time doing all this research.
Let me think. I think one of the great stories of the Pacers' first couple of seasons is Reggie Harding, who is
whole chapter on him. Yep.
Yeah, I did a whole chapter on him. I thought he deserved it. And I got Reggie's autograph when I was a kid, which I show in the back of the book. I saw him at the airport one day. Reggie still gets talked about in basketball circles, and you'll see things on social media where people bring up Reggie Harding. Fascinating guy, a 7-foot center, really talented. He almost went straight from high school to the NBA. He went to like a prep school or whatever in between. I think it was in Tennessee. He had to go one more year. He never got his high school diploma. But Reggie was a charismatic, nice guy, but grew up in the ghetto in Detroit and had a shaky home situation and just couldn't stay out of trouble. He was always getting fined, suspended, whatever, but he played 20-some games with the Pacers. He outplayed Mel Daniels in head-to-head competition. I mean, he was really good. To me, if he'd had his head on straight and had a better beginning in life, would probably be in the Hall of Fame today. The Pacers had him for part of the season, but then he found a way to get himself suspended before the playoffs and wasn't with them then. But, they were on the verge of becoming a really good team with him, and then it all fell apart. But he was a tragic story and wound up getting shot and killed in Detroit a few years after he was with the Pacers. And it's really a shame because it's kind of a what could have been story. So he was just a real interesting guy. The teammates liked him. but he was just so maddening because he'd be late for this or not show up for that, just so irresponsible. So he's just one of the all-time great what could have been stories in basketball.
I really appreciated your story about hunting down his autograph in the airport, not only because it was a personal anecdote, but because you included in there how people's memories can be so shaky because in your mind it was a Sunday, but you can check that it was a Thursday, right? So that makes reporting these longer details so difficult.
Yeah, when you're interviewing people, you hear a lot of things that sound great, but when you have the opportunity to check them either in a newspaper or whatever, they don't check out. And I don't accuse people of lying because our memories play tricks on us. If you're talking about 50 years ago, you can't necessarily remember every detail accurately. So for some reason, I remember that being a Sunday when we were out at the airport to meet my mom who was flying in. But it turned out to be a Thursday because my mom kept the journal and detailed it. So I was able to prove it. And then I was able to say that this was the day after he had a big game and the day before he had another big game, and why he was at the airport, I have no idea. But yeah, I'll have a player. I know one player, the guards tell me he had 13 rebounds in a game one time, pro game, and you could look this stuff up on Basketball Reference, and no, he didn't actually. And again, I don't think he's lying. I just think he, for some reason, that was in his memory. I'm personally guilty because I, for years, had told people one of my sports highlights as a kid was throwing a 2-hit shutout in Little League Baseball. But speaking of my mom's journals, I ran across it where she was at that game and wrote in the journal that day that I got the pitch and my team won 11-6. So obviously I didn't throw a 2-hit shutout, and that kind of triggered a memory that I had a 2-hit shutout for like 3 or 4 innings and then didn't. And I wasn't lying to people. My mind had just kind of convinced itself that I had done it, and I think that happens a lot in sports where an athlete or anybody will convince themselves that something had happened that really didn't. And in most cases, you can check things out in a newspaper or online somewhere, or you could always go talk to other people. I had one player told me that Marvin Gaye once played a pickup game with the ABA Pacers in the 70s, but only one guy tells me that and nobody else remembers it. So it's just one guy. Another guy told me that when the Pacers were in Memphis one time to play in the ABA, Elvis invited the Pacers out to Graceland Mansion at his guest. But again, one guy remembers it, nobody else does. So maybe the guys had a dream, or who knows how these things get in our heads. But you have one person tell you a great story that would be great to put in a book, but you have 4 or 5 other guys who say, I don't remember that. So you just have to discard it that way. So that's why, Tony, I'm a skeptic of oral histories. Because if you just put a microphone in front of somebody and ask for their stories, you'll hear great stories, but you need to double check them. And that's part of the issue I have with Loose Balls, which is a classic ABA book. There's tons of great stories in there, but I know some of them that relate to the Pacers are not true. And the newspapers will verify that they aren't true. He had Mel Daniels telling an anecdote. Well, Mel wasn't even at the game that he's talking about because he was back home. He had the flu and didn't go on that road trip. So oral histories, I'm skeptic of. If you're really going to have a serious journalistic project, you need to verify everything you can, or at least say that it may be true, it may not. There's other versions of the story, that kind of thing. So that's what I try to do in Reborn.
Well, hey, you could have, per baseball scoring, it could have been a 2-inning shutout with a bunch of errors, and you had no earned runs. I
had no infield behind me.
It was just you pitching with no other team. Mark, thank you very much for this time. This has been wonderful. Anyone listening who's still here, I highly recommend you check out Reborn. You can get it in bookstores, on Amazon. Mark, is there a way you'd prefer people order this?
Amazon is probably the best way now. I don't know if it's in local bookstores. It might be in some, but not all. The book now, it's been, 5 years or so since it came out. So bookstores may not carry, but it's certainly on Amazon. I always have copies. If people know how to get a hold of me, I can get something directly to them. So it's out there. There's only a few hundred copies left. I'm looking forward to getting to a second printing. I can tweak a few things and make it a little bit better. So we are almost running out of the first edition of the book, but it is still available.
Highly recommend anyone checks it out, and the rest of Mark's work on his website. Thank you all for listening today. We will see you soon.